In the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus, in the summer of 41 BCE, a woman who once wore a royal diadem was dragged from her sacred refuge and executed. Ancient authors recorded the moment. Plutarch in his Life of Antony, Cassius Dio in his Roman History, and Appian in his Civil Wars all described soldiers violating the temple's asylum to seize and kill Arsinoe IV, the sister of Cleopatra VII. Archaeological work at the Artemis Ion confirms continuous cult activity into the Roman imperial period. Inscriptions preserved on-site attest to the long-held, inviolable right of asylum in that sanctuary. This matters because temple refuge was legally sacred. Its violation was a deliberate political signal. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. Plutarch's account is clear on the dates and the actors. Marcus Antonius himself authorized the act in 41 BCE, under the influence of Cleopatra. This recorded fact raises immediate questions about Roman respect for Greek sanctuaries and the political calculus of Antony and Cleopatra, which I will unpack next. This includes the origins of Arsinoe's claim, and how she came to be in Ephesus. It's a story rooted in coin finds, papyri, and contemporary chronicles that point to a family feud with consequences far beyond a single execution. This sets up the next development, the Ptolemaic succession crisis that forced Arsinoe into sanctuary and exile. Archaeology and numismatics give us the first tangible traces of Arsinoe's public career. Coins bearing the name Arsinoe and royal diadems have been recovered in Anatolia and coastal Aegean hordes. Datable by style to the 40s and 30s BCE, they indicate her claim to royal status before her capture. Inscriptions from Ephesus and nearby cities preserve dedications to Artemis during the late Hellenistic period, demonstrating the temple's continued political centrality. Primary narratives from Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Appian place Arsinoe's rise in the context of the Ptolemaic succession after Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, and the ensuing war between Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIII. I will show how inscriptions and coins corroborate these literary sources. Hoards dated to the 40s BCE include issues with Ptolemaic royal imagery and overstrikes, suggesting rapid political turnover. The consequence of those turnovers was that sibling rivalry became state policy, and sanctuary refuge was turned into a political trap. From numismatics, we move to papyri. Administrative records from Egypt, preserved in Oxyrhynchus, show the bureaucratic footprint of Ptolemaic rule and the vulnerabilities of claimants like Arsinoe. This leads to her flight and the support she found among local Greek cities, a support network that would later determine her fate. Ptolemaic succession in Alexandria was a documented pattern of sibling co-rulership, marriage, and fratricide. Papyrological evidence from the Ptolemaic period, including petitions and tax records dated in regal years, shows how the royal household distributed land titles and priesthoods to secure loyalty. The brief reign of Berenice IV in 58 and 55 BCE, attested in Greek chronicles and coins, demonstrates this earlier tendency. When her father was in Rome, a sister took power and was later executed when the exiled king returned, recorded by Josephus and other Roman historians. These precedents expla.
She didn't yet understand what that meant. She was about to learn that Rome's version of mercy was far more terrifying than its cruelty. This wasn't about individual lives. It was psychological warfare. Rome knew that physical conquest wasn't enough. True domination meant breaking a people's spirit, corrupting their traditions, proving that even their most protected women now belonged to Rome. This wasn't random brutality. It was targeted dehumanization, a message broadcast to every conquered territory: resist Rome, and you lose everything. What unfolded that day would become so infamous that the Senate would soon be forced to act. At exactly 3 p.m., as shadows stretched across the blood-stained arena, the master of games descended into the hypogeum, the labyrinth beneath the Colosseum. The corridor reeked of damp stone and fear. He approached Gaius Valerius Maximus, presenting a bronze tablet listing the available spoils. Gaius's hands still trembled from combat, adrenaline coursing through him. "The Emperor honors your victory," the official recited. "By imperial tradition, you are entitled to the spoils of conquest. Choose." No one present knew that this routine choice, repeated countless times before, would ignite a crisis reaching the Senate floor within weeks. The tablet listed his options: gold, wine, a night in a proper bed, or Victoria Carnalis, the carnal privilege granted to a victor. For a man who owned nothing and could be killed at any moment, this was one of the few times he held any power at all. Roman society didn't just permit this, it celebrated it. To Rome, the conquered existed to serve the conqueror. That was the empire's brutal logic, perfected over generations. The preparations began. Inside the women's holding area, guards entered carrying buckets of water, not for drinking, but for washing the prisoners. The women were scrubbed down, their hair combed, their torn garments replaced with plain tunics. Sabina watched as attendants moved from woman to woman, inspecting them and marking details on wax tablets. An older woman, a priestess named Zamaxis, once devoted to the Dacian Sun Temple, whispered the truth they all feared: "They're preparing us either for spectacle or for what comes after." The preparations ended quickly. But elsewhere in the arena, something far darker was being arranged, something that would turn a routine act of exploitation into a scandal debated by historians for centuries. Above, 50,000 spectators settled into their seats for the afternoon's secondary entertainment. Between major gladiator matches, officials staged what they called interludes, mock hunts, scripted battles, and what Roman writers politely termed mythological reenactments, which often ended in real deaths for condemned prisoners. But today's showcase held a new twist, a theatrical display celebrating Rome's dominance over barbarian shame. The arena called. 20 Dacian women were lifted into the arena through the underground elevator system, an engineering marvel designed to launch animals, fighters, and props through hidden traps. Sabina stepped out into blinding sunlight and a deafening wave of noise. The roar of the crowd struck her like a physical blow. She smelled roasting meat from vendors, perfumes drifting from wealthy seats, and beneath it all the iron stench of dried blood baking into the sand. What should have been a straightforward execution was twisted into calculated humiliation. The women were lined up as a her. ALD announced their supposed crimes: rebellion, aiding enemies, refusing Roman gods. Then came the twist. They would be forced to fight each other in pairs, using wooden swords, dressed in tattered clothing meant to mock them. The winners would be claimed by Rome's champions. The losers would die. If this level of cruelty shocks you, tap like, because what comes next reveals how this wasn't chaos. It was policy. The breaking point arrived. Wooden swords were handed out. Sabina gripped hers, the rough wood scraping her palm. Across from her stood Camasica, sister, the woman who had once taught her to weave and sung at her engagement ceremony. Their eyes met. The crowd screamed for blood. The master of games raised his hand and dropped it. Neither woman moved. The roar shifted. Excitement turned to confusion, then rage. "Fight!" The crowd chanted. "Cowards! Barbarians!" Trash rained down, olive pits, food scraps, anything within reach. Still, the women did not lift their swords. It was the only resistance left to them: refusal. For 90 full seconds, the world's greatest empire was publicly defied by two unarmed women standing in silence. Then the guards stormed in. The staged drama dissolved into real violence. Camasica was struck from behind with the flat of a sword, collapsing onto the sand. The crowd cheered. Sabina screamed and rushed toward her, dropping her wooden sword. Both were dragged away not to execution, but to something the audience found just as entertaining. The real horror began in the hypogeum below. The bureaucratic machine of Roman exploitation moved without pause. A scribe noted in the record, 20 female captives, Dacian origin, processed for post-victory allocation. Next line, 2 resistant. Transferred to private chambers for champions' exclusive use. What came next was Rome's most polished system of dehumanization, human beings reduced to inventory. Sabina and Kamasica were separated, each taken to different rooms, small stone chambers with benches, iron rings embedded in the walls, and doors that locked from the outside. They were clean, organized, and terrifying because everything was planned. This wasn't improvised cruelty. These rooms were part of the arena's original design, as intentional as the lion cages or gladiator lifts. At 4 p.m., Gaius Valerius Maximus entered Sabina's chamber. The door opened. Their eyes met. He stood in full arena gear, another man's blood streaked across his chest. She was pressed against the far wall, drained and unarmed. Between them stood the full weight of Roman law. He had complete legal power. She had none. She was classified as spoils, a reward earned through killing. History does not tell us what Gaius thought in that moment. Did he see a person? Property? Did he question the system that made him both weapon and prisoner? All we know comes from a clerk's routine report. Then, the unimaginable happened. An act of rebellion. Gaius removed his helmet, set his sword aside, and sat down, his head in his hands. For 5 long minutes, he said nothing. Sabina remained frozen, waiting for a violence that never came. Finally, he spoke in broken Dacian, a language he'd picked up from other captives. What was his name? He asked. Mine? She replied. No. The man they made you watch die. Diges. He sighed. I killed a Dacian today named Diges. Might be family. Your people use that name often. What followed was not the assault Rome expected. It was a conversation between two people the empire had tried to strip of every shred of humanity. Gaius told her of his father, executed when he was 9. Sabina spoke of her home, burned to the ground. 2 hours passed. Guards checked twice, heard voices, assumed compliance, and moved on. At 6 p.m., Gaius Valerius Maximus made the choice Rome would never forgive. He stood, walked to the chamber door, and called for the guard. This woman is ill, he declared. Infected. I refuse the allocation. Send her to the physician. It was the only loophole the arena allowed. If a captive was labeled diseased, a gladiator could legally reject her. The lie was obvious. The guard knew it. But Roman bureaucracy ran on rigid procedure. Challenging the claim meant paperwork and witnesses. Accepting it took seconds. And so, Sabina was removed, taken to the medical holding section. Her immediate fate was spared, but she would die 3 days later from a common infection, the most frequent killer inside Roman captivity. The medical unit was overcrowded, filthy, and indifferent. The mercy that saved her from one horror delivered her to another. Gaius never saw her again. He fought twice more that month, winning both bouts and refusing his rewards both times. The empire took notice. Whispers spread through the gladiator barracks, Maximus has gone soft. He's joined one of those Eastern cults. He's been cursed by Dacian witches. But the truth was simpler, he had remembered what it meant to be human. Rome's point of no return. On September 15, 79 AD, Senator Quintus Aurelius Semicus stood before the Senate with an official complaint. His young nephew, a junior gladiator, had been beaten by his trainer for refusing the customary reward after a victory. The nephew claimed Maximus's example had inspired him. The trainer insisted he was upholding proper Roman values. It was a trivial case barely worth discussion except for one thing: it forced Rome's most powerful men to publicly acknowledge a practice everyone knew about, but no one ever mentioned. Senate records, the sanitized versions that survive, mention a debate about the appropriateness of certain customs regarding defeated female captives. That mild phrase concealed a 4-hour political battle over whether Rome had crossed a line even its own senators could no longer ignore. The conservative bloc, led by Senator Fabius, invoked tradition: our ancestors conquered body and spirit. This forged our greatness. The reformist faction, influenced by Stoic philosophy, argued back: we are creating martyrs. We are sowing rebellion. Dead rebels are gone, but traumatized survivors carry memories that fuel uprisings for generations. But the true trigger wasn't morality. It was political survival. 3 provincial governors had recently reported surges in revolt, each citing Rome's treatment of captive women as propaganda for resistance. These governors warned, Rome wasn't intimidating its enemies anymore. It was radicalizing them. The empire was harming itself. The law that shocked Rome. On October 1, 79 AD, the Senate passed what historians later called the Lex Captiva, the law of captive women. Its terms were limited but unprecedented: female prisoners of war could no longer be distributed as public rewards in the arena. Public humiliation of conquered women was banned in official spectacles. Private exploitation continued, but the theatrical showcase was outlawed. Enforcement was unreliable. Many arena managers ignored the law or found loopholes. But the principle stood: even Rome had public limits. Ironically, the law did nothing to free anyone. It only removed the audience. 3 months later, Gaius Valerius Maximus finally earned his freedom, not for kindness, but for winning 5 more consecutive bouts. His last recorded act as a free man was purchasing the freedom of a Dacian woman named Camasica. The archives identify only her name. Historians strongly suspect she was the same woman who stood beside Sabina on the arena sand. Imagine Gaius realizing that his single act of defiance saved one woman for a handful of days, nothing more. It changed nothing for the thousands who came before, or the thousands who would follow. The machine was too vast, too profitable, too embedded in Roman culture. His rebellion was a raindrop in an ocean of blood. Imagine Sabina's final hours, dying from a preventable infection, surrounded by other prisoners the empire didn't even bother to document. Not one senator debated her death. Not one historian recorded her name. In Rome's moral calculus, her suffering wasn't noteworthy enough to register. The tragedy isn't merely that Rome was cruel. Cruelty defined ancient warfare. The true tragedy is that Rome industrialized it, turned it into entertainment, standardized it with paperwork, supply chains, and architectural planning. A system so complete that people vanished into it without a trace except for scratches on stone. In 2018, archaeologists from the University of Rome, led by Dr. Isabella Fortunato, excavated a forgotten section of the Eastern Hypogeum. What they found never made it onto tourist brochures: a cluster of small chambers with iron restraints built into the walls. Drainage channels cut into the floors. Scratch marks carved by desperate hands. Pottery fragments. Remnants of bedding. Carbon dating confirmed the rooms were part of the original construction, built intentionally, not added later. 6 bronze tags were recovered, stamped with the word captiva and dates spanning 79 to 82 AD, the exact years of the Dacian suppression. These findings matched textual evidence. Cassius Dio's later writings described allocation chambers for conquered women. Seneca's letters alluded vaguely to the practice. Tacitus, normally graphic, was conspicuously silent, implying even he found it too repulsive to record plainly. Historians still debate its frequency. Some argue it was rare, reserved for major triumphs. Others point to the specialized construction and multiple sources, suggesting it was routine. The truth lies somewhere in between, not constant, but common enough to design infrastructure for. Romans treated gladiators like ancient celebrities, but with a dark twist. Elite women bribed guards to meet them. Their sweat and blood were sold as aphrodisiacs. Some women even drank it as a fertility cure. The same society that worshipped these men also fed them into machines of death and rewarded them with human beings. Historical accounts describe nocturnal entertainments after major games, where wealthy patrons mingled with gladiators and slaves. Women captured in war were paraded as trophies, sometimes forced to reenact myths involving gods like Jupiter or Mars before being gifted away. None of it was accidental. It was a message to the world: Rome owns your past, your present, and your future. Gladiator games weren't random. They were part of the munera obligations owed to the public. Patrons who hosted games had every incentive to increase the spectacle. Humiliation of captives became a selling point. The 19th century historian Theodore Mommsen called this Rome's most efficient machine of dehumanization. What he meant was simple: Rome didn't just conquer bodies. It conquered identity, memory, and meaning. The fact that we still debate these events shows how deep the scars run. The 2000 film Gladiator barely whispered about this reality. Modern scholars still argue whether discussing these practices exposes Roman brutality responsibly or simply sensationalizes it. But it matters. Because it shows how a civilization can defend cruelty through laws, customs, and entertainment. Rome wasn't the only empire capable of horrifying acts, but it perfected the ability to normalize them. To turn violence into ritual, and transform screams into crowd-pleasing spectacle. The deeper truth is this: the line separating civilization from barbarism has never been measured by marble temples, paved roads, or towering arches, but by how a society treats those with no power at all. Rome engineered aqueducts that survived 2,000 years, yet at the same time built chambers beneath its stadiums where human beings were violated as casually as props in a play. Its brilliance and its moral emptiness existed side by side, without contradiction. It also reveals how power distorts everyone it touches. Gaius was both victim and tool, enslaved, controlled, forced to kill for survival, yet granted authority over someone even more helpless than himself. The system twisted ordinary people into instruments of cruelty and turned human suffering into entertainment when it should have stirred empathy, not applause. It warns us about the danger of using tradition as moral justification. Our ancestors did it, became Rome's answer to every ethical question until habit replaced humanity, and atrocity became routine. And it raises questions we still struggle with today: what other buried horrors lie beneath the monuments we admire? How many tourist attractions sit on layers of forgotten misery? When does confronting the past become necessary? And when does it cross into exploitation? Think of Sabina's final moments, dying of infection in a cramped cell beneath the grandest structure of her time. Did she wonder if anyone would remember her? Did she imagine that 2,000 years later, archaeologists might find her tag and speak her name aloud again? History's darkest stories remind us that progress isn't guaranteed, that civilizations fall morally long before they fall physically, and that every generation must choose between empathy and efficiency. Rome chose spectacle. The cost was measured in lives erased. But the lesson survives in the ruins beneath the arena floor. And so a gladiator's victory became permission for cruelty. A routine reward became one of Rome's most carefully buried scandals. Hundreds of Dacian captives disappeared into bureaucratic lists. And one young woman named Sabina survived only because a single fighter made an unusual choice, a choice that changed nothing, except to prove that humanity could still flicker, even in Rome's darkest machinery. If this story unsettled you, subscribe because uncomfortable truths matter far more than comforting myths. Tell us in the comments, what disturbed you most? The calculated nature of the exploitation? Or Rome's efficiency at making it routine? Remember, history's darkest secrets often hide beneath civilization's greatest monuments. The blood on the sand wasn't always from battle. Sometimes it came from innocence turned into spectacle. From power without restraint. From the moments when humanity looked away, while cruelty received applause.